In recent years, historical injustices have been increasingly discussed, including in the context of the Anglo-Irish conflict, a centuries-long struggle for Ireland's independence and cultural self-determination. This conflict began in the Middle Ages with the English conquest of Ireland, as they sought to exert control over its lands. The struggle and its consequences are reflected in art, for example, in Martin Scorsese's film Gangs of New York, where Irish immigrants fight for survival, or in the series The Crown, which highlights the tragic assassination of Lord Mountbatten by an IRA terrorist attack. However, this is only part of the tragic history. In the 17th century, tens of thousands of Irish were sold into slavery, and brutal repression led to a sharp decline in the population of Ireland. Nonetheless, the Irish preserved their culture, language, and national spirit, which became the foundation of their fight for freedom. Today, relations between England and Ireland have improved, but the perception of the past remains complex and contradictory. To understand the nature of this conflict, it is important to return to its origins and more deeply explore the historical processes that affected both sides. Ireland came under English control during the Tudor era in the 16th century. Prior to this, there was only the Lordship of Ireland, which did not encompass the entire island, making governance significantly more challenging. During this period, the Anglicization of the territory began, along with the colonization of specific Irish lands, particularly Ulster. However, the true confrontation between the two peoples occurred during the Reformation. British monarchs broke away from the Pope and created their own distinct form of Christianity, Anglicanism, with the monarch as the head of the church. The country was divided into Protestants, who constituted the majority, and Catholics, who were the minority. This religious conflict exacerbated political instability. The throne frequently alternated between Catholic and Protestant monarchs. England ultimately achieved victory after the Glorious Revolution. Why is it important to know about the religious events of this period? The Irish were among the first Catholics in this part of the world, steadfastly adhering to their faith despite facing discrimination, which became a challenge for the English crown. The political instability of the English Revolution era led to local uprisings. The Bolton Uprising was a consequence of King Charles I's broken promise, a supporter of the Catholic faith. The Scottish Gaels, relatives of the Irish, supported him in the Civil War, providing financial assistance. However, by then, Charles had been defeated and was executed in 1649. Afterwards, England was declared a republic, and Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector. His reconquest of Ireland was so brutal that the Irish still associate him with the image of the English Hitler. Battle-hardened soldiers captured fortresses, executed Catholic priests, and committed what can only be described as genocide. But these actions were not solely the result of religious fanaticism. The military campaigns also sought to redistribute property. A bourgeois revolution was taking place in Ireland, aimed at taking land from local aristocrats for the benefit of English colonists. By 1654, more than 10,000 Irish in settlements had to vacate their lands for English colonists, facing execution for resistance. Rebels and certain priests were deported to the Caribbean colonies as semi-slaves. The population of Ireland decreased almost threefold, from 1.5 million to 600,000. In their place, 150,000 Protestant settlers from England arrived in Ireland in search of free land. Interestingly, by the mid-17th century, 70% of the total population of Montserrat consisted of Irish slaves. Ireland quickly became the largest source of slaves for English merchants, and the majority of the first slaves sent to the New World were white. When the monarchy was restored, Charles II ordered the exhumation of Oliver Cromwell's body, who had already died from a combination of malaria and typhoid fever. His remains were hanged for treason, then beheaded, and the head was displayed near Westminster Palace. Soon after, the head was stolen and remained in a private collection until 1960. The next significant event was the Battle of the Boyne, a decisive confrontation between Catholics and Protestants that took place in 1690. The army of the deposed Catholic King James II, supported by the Irish, was defeated, marking the beginning of a new phase of suffering for them. Following James II's disgraceful escape to France, the Irish gave him the ignominious nickname James the Shit. The remaining lands still held by Catholics were confiscated and sold to Anglicans. As a result, while the Irish were no longer sold into slavery, throughout the 18th century, they faced harsh discriminatory policies aimed at subjugating the rebellious region and artificially forming an Anglican elite. Laws restricted the rights of Catholics and Presbyterians, excluding them from governmental structures, the army, education, and other areas of life. Thus, Ireland found itself on the periphery of social and political life, with 90% of all land in the country owned by its conquerors and collaborators. It is evident that after all these events, the Irish were long awaiting an opportune moment for an uprising. Although some restrictions were partially lifted by the end of the 18th century, tensions remained high. Earlier, the Irish had tried to take advantage of the civil wars in England, but a new opportunity arose during the Revolutionary Wars in Europe. The French Revolution of 1789 sparked a wave of wars that continued almost uninterrupted for the next quarter century. The Irish, with the support of France, once again rose up in rebellion in 1798. This rebellion differed from previous ones in that its goals were inspired by the American and French revolutions. The primary aim was to establish an independent Republic of Ireland. The leaders of the movement, representing the organization, the United Irishmen, were mostly Protestants, Presbyterians, or Anglicans. One of the most prominent leaders was Theobald Wolfe Tone, an Anglican and committed Republican. The movement also attracted Lord Edward Fitzgerald, a member of the Irish Parliament and a representative of one of the island's most distinguished families. To strengthen their position, the Irish sought support from revolutionary France, which was at war with Great Britain at the time. The French agreed to provide assistance, sending a 15,000-strong expeditionary force under the command of Louis-Lazare Hoche. However, the weather conditions were unfavorable. The fleet encountered severe storms, and most of it was destroyed. The surviving ships returned home, and the failed expedition became the subject of mockery and caricature in England. Despite this setback, the Irish resolved to begin the uprising without waiting for further French aid. However, the United Irishmen had many English informants in their ranks. One of them, lawyer Francis Megan, passed information about Lord Fitzgerald to the authorities, earning a reward equivalent to £1.5 million in today's money. Many of the rebellion's leaders, including the ailing Fitzgerald, were captured or killed before it even began. Despite these setbacks, the uprising still broke out. A small French detachment of about 1,000 men under the command of General Jean-Joseph Amable Humbert landed to aid the Irish. Soon, they were joined by local volunteers. The rebels managed to achieve several victories, including the capture of the town of Castlebar, which was declared the capital of the Republic of Connacht. However, the Republic lasted only a week and a half. The main forces of the British Army quickly suppressed the uprising, and the French troops were captured. At that time, Ireland was formally still a separate kingdom under the rule of the British monarch. However, the rebellion of 1798 served as a pretext for the final incorporation of Ireland into Great Britain. Despite resistance from the Irish Parliament, the Act of Union was passed in 1801, and Ireland became part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. George III, the British monarch, had promised to end the discrimination against Catholics, but soon reneged on his words, citing a violation of his coronation oath to uphold the Anglican Church. As a result, Catholic emancipation was delayed for nearly 30 years until 1829. In the mid-19th century, the Irish faced a new catastrophe. In 1845, potato crops, which fed the majority of the population, began to fail. A potato blight devastated a significant portion of the harvest, leading to the tragedy known as the Great Famine. For 3 years, starting in 1845, the potato crop failed repeatedly. As a result, much of the population was left without food. Despite understanding the scale of the crisis, the British government took limited measures. It organized public jobs, hiring impoverished tenants who made up the majority of Ireland's population. However, wages were paid in food rather than money, which exacerbated their dependence on government assistance. Meanwhile, the export of grain from Ireland was not halted. Grain, the reserves of which were sufficient to feed all the starving, continued to be exported to England, fueling discontent among the Irish. The famine was accompanied by typhus and cholera epidemics, which claimed thousands of lives. The loss of livelihoods and the inability to feed their families led to a mass exodus from the country. Over 5 years, from 1845 to 1850, Ireland's population decreased by 1.5 million from 8 million. Approximately 1 million died from starvation and disease, while the rest fled to other countries, predominantly to the United States. Amid the crisis caused by the famine, an uprising inspired by the revolutionary Springtime of Nations that swept across Europe occurred in Ireland in 1848. However, the young Irish rebels were quickly defeated, although by the mid-19th century, the most egregious discriminatory laws against the Irish had been repealed. Their social and economic status remained dire. For centuries, the Irish had been prohibited from owning land, which became the property of either English or Scottish owners. As the population grew, poverty only intensified, forcing more Irish people to emigrate. Ireland became the only European country in the 19th century to lose half of its population. By the beginning of the 20th century, the island's population was about 4 million, half of what it had been before the Great Famine. Emigrants formed large diasporas, especially in the US, where Irish settlers tried to preserve their traditions and maintain connections with their homeland. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, the struggle for Irish autonomy began. In the 1870s, the Home Rule movement emerged. Irish nationalists sought to achieve autonomous status for Ireland within the British Empire. The leader of the movement was Charles Stewart Parnell, an Anglican who became a symbol of moderate nationalism. However, radical nationalists, most of whom were Catholic, demanded not just autonomy, but full independence. During this time, the so-called Celtic Revival began. The Irish intelligentsia, striving to preserve the national culture, founded the Gaelic League, with the aim of reviving the Irish language and traditions. However, this process proved to be complex. The Irish language was predominantly rural and had numerous dialects, which made standardization difficult. In cities, English dominated, and education in schools was conducted exclusively in English. Despite the efforts of enthusiasts, the language failed to become a national standard. In 1914, after decades of parliamentary struggle, Britain passed the Home Rule Act, promising to grant Ireland autonomy. However, the outbreak of World War I delayed its implementation, and by then, radicals were no longer willing to accept partial concessions. They demanded full independence. One of the most prominent figures of the radical movement was Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. Born in the 1830s, he lived through the Great Famine and joined the fight for Irish liberation from an early age. Rossa called for attacking the English everywhere. For his activities, he was imprisoned, and after 5 years of incarceration, he was released on the condition that he would never return to Ireland. He moved to the USA, where he continued his work and joined the Fenian Brotherhood, a radical organization of Irishmen fighting for an independent Irish republic. Rossa published journals and advocated for fighting the English with dynamite and bullets. The Fenians even conceived a plan to cause tensions between the USA and Canada, hoping the Irish could spark an uprising. Several raids by Irish militants, known as the Fenian Raids on Canada, took place. Interestingly, they managed to strain US-Canada relations, as Canada suspected the US of harboring the Fenians due to their tacit support of Confederates during the Civil War. In the 1880s, the Fenians conducted the so-called Dynamite Campaign, aimed at attacking British infrastructure. The explosions in British cities targeted symbols of authority and government institutions rather than people. However, despite these precautions, there were a few accidental casualties throughout the campaign. Jeremiah O'Donovan Rosa died in 1915 at the age of 83. His body was brought back to Ireland, where he was received as a hero. The funeral was a significant national event, symbolizing Ireland's ongoing struggle for freedom. During the funeral, attended by thousands, poet and future leader of the 1916 Easter Rising, Patrick Pearse, delivered his famous speech. From a young age, Patrick Pearse was drawn to the ideas of Irish nationalism. His views were significantly influenced by his English father and Catholic mother, who had lived through the Great Famine. In his youth, Pearse was inspired by Charles Stewart Parnell, the leader of the Home Rule movement. Pearse frequently traveled to the United States, where he sought funding from the Irish diaspora. These trips had a radicalizing effect on him. While he initially supported the idea of autonomy, after interacting with immigrants, he became an advocate for full independence and armed struggle. Upon returning, he focused on establishing the Irish Volunteers, a clandestine army funded by its members. The volunteers were trained by professionals, preparing them for a future uprising. The outbreak of World War I caused a split in the movement. Some nationalists supported Britain, hoping that it would grant Ireland autonomy after the war. However, another faction, including Pearse, continued to prepare for an uprising. Seeing the war as an opportune moment, British troops were occupied on the continent. Simultaneously, tensions between Catholics and Protestants were escalating in Ireland, particularly in Northern Ireland, where Unionists loyal to the Crown opposed the idea of independence. Against this backdrop, Irish radicals entered negotiations with Germany. Roger Casement, a former British diplomat, proposed that the Germans support the Irish with arms and even organize a landing of troops on the western coast. The Germans agreed only to send weapons, but British intelligence quickly discovered the plans. Casement, who arrived in Ireland by submarine, was arrested, and the ship carrying the weapons was intercepted. Realizing that the uprising was doomed, movement leaders, including Pearse, decided to revolt before they were arrested. On April 24, 1916, the Easter Rising began. The rebels numbered about 1,000 people, lacking sufficient weapons and having no artillery at all. They managed to capture the General Post Office building, where Patrick Pearse read the proclamation of the Irish Republic. However, they could not hold even a few of the captured buildings. British troops arrived within a couple of days and began shelling. Many civilians were killed. In less than a week, the rebels surrendered. The chances of success would have been higher if the uprising had spread to other parts of the country. However, one of the leaders of the Irish Volunteers, and also a scholar-linguist, Eamon de Valera, did not believe in the success of the rebellion from the outset. As soon as he learned that the plan for German assistance had failed, he withdrew from the hopeless uprising and ordered all other rebels outside Dublin not to partake in the futile adventure. As was typical of the British, most of the leaders of the uprising were executed. Eamon de Valera, who commanded one of the contingents, escaped execution because he was a US citizen. He subsequently became one of the main Irish politicians of the 20th century, spending 16 years as Prime Minister and another 15 years as President of an independent Ireland. Although the uprising was practically pointless, the harsh British reaction turned the executed leaders into martyrs and national heroes. Among those executed was Patrick Pearse. To this day, the Irish organize a parade on the eve of Easter with the participation of the country's leading politicians. The rebellion led to an explosive growth in the popularity of the previously obscure Sinn Féin party. Although it was not involved in the uprising, rumors attributed the events to Sinn Féin, increasing the party's popularity. Furthermore, many rank-and-file participants of the uprising joined Sinn Féin after being released from prison. Attempts to introduce home rule in Ireland encountered resistance from British Conservatives. In the general election, Sinn Féin received the overwhelming majority of Irish votes. Before this, the Irish had supported a moderate party. Riding the wave of enormous support, nationalists from Sinn Féin unilaterally created an Irish parliament and proclaimed Ireland's independence. The government of the Irish Republic was formed, led by de Valera. The British, unsurprisingly, were not willing to recognize Ireland. The War of Independence began. This time, the rebels enjoyed massive public support, which allowed the formation of the famous Irish Republican Army, IRA. In response, the Loyalists declared their separation from Ireland. Although the war lasted nearly 3 years, there were no large-scale battles. The IRA primarily used guerrilla tactics. The conflict dragged on. The British decided to compromise and grant Ireland Dominion status. By that time, all white colonies with developed populations had such a status. But Ireland did not. The British offered the rebels a treaty on their terms. Ireland would be granted Dominion status, but Northern Ireland, predominantly populated by Loyalist Protestants, had the right to opt out of the Irish state at any time. Moreover, Britain retained control over key Irish ports. The signing of the treaty led to a crisis and a split in the Irish movement, dividing it into supporters and opponents of the treaty. Comrades who had recently fought side by side against the British found themselves on opposite sides. The majority of the IRA members and de Valera himself opposed the treaty. The former IRA commander and new Prime Minister of the Irish Dominion, Michael Collins, supported the agreement, but was soon killed in a skirmish with former comrades. The split also affected Sinn Féin. A civil war began in Ireland. The IRA went underground, and the official army became the National Army, which was supplied by the British. In 1937, Ireland adopted a new constitution, which effectively declared the country a republic. However, formally, the island remained a British dominion. Full independence was achieved only in 1949, after the Second World War, when the British Empire began losing its colonies, and the pressure on London to grant independence increased. Ireland seized this opportunity for a final break, but Northern Ireland remained part of the Britain, which would have devastating consequences. Despite achieving long-awaited independence in 1949, from the late 1960s began one of the most complex and tragic periods in the history of Northern Ireland. It was a turbulent time marked by student and youth protests, a rise in leftist sentiments, and the increased activity of terrorist organizations. The Irish Republican Army, IRA, came to the forefront during this period, becoming the main instrument of radical resistance to British rule in Northern Ireland. Their actions prompted a harsh response from the British authorities, which only intensified the conflict. Beginning in 1971, the British government officially started the practice of arrest without trial. People were not just detained, but were imprisoned indefinitely without any judicial proceedings. Northern Ireland was in a situation resembling martial law. This was part of an overall strategy to suppress resistance, but only increase the bitterness of the population. One of the key and most tragic events of this period occurred on January 30th, 1972, known as Bloody Sunday. On this day, British troops brutally dispersed a peaceful demonstration in the city of Derry, protesting against the policy of arrest without trial. It's worth noting that the locals categorically refused to call the city Londonderry, considering it a name imposed by the British authorities. If in the 17th century, Derry was a symbol of Protestant resistance, by the 20th century, it had become a symbol of Catholic resistance and was one of the strongholds of the Irish Republican Army. The dispersal of the demonstration led to numerous casualties. This event caused widespread resonance and became a catalyst for further violence. Bombings, explosions, and armed clashes became part of daily life. One of the most notorious events of that time was the murder of Lord Mountbatten in 1979. Mountbatten, a relative of the British Queen, owned a castle in the Republic of Ireland and regularly went there on vacation. This fact caused particular outrage from the IRA. and they organized a terrorist attack by blowing up his boat. It was a symbolic warning to the British monarchy. After this, security measures in the United Kingdom were significantly strengthened. For example, access to the Prime Minister's residence on Downing Street was restricted. Half a century ago, the street was open to the public, but one day, Irish militants rolled up a cannon and shelled it. Since then, the street has been closed from free access. Since the late 1970s, the struggle for the rights of IRA prisoners gained new significance. Members of the organization demanded political prisoner status, which entailed certain privileges: the right to wear their own clothes, not perform prison work, communicate with other prisoners, and receive additional visits and parcels. However, the British government, led by Margaret Thatcher, categorically refused to make concessions. Her stance was firm: there are no political crimes, only criminal ones. The prisoners began a series of protests. First, they refused to wear prison uniforms, for which they were deprived of the opportunity to use showers and toilets. They were given chamber pots, but refusing to comply, the prisoners began pouring them on the walls of their cells. These conditions, the complete lack of hygiene and minimal comforts, led to even greater tension. The culmination came in 1981 with the start of a hunger strike by IRA prisoners. It was first initiated by Bobby Sands, a terrorist, poet, and politician who became a symbol of resistance. He went on a hunger strike for 66 days and died, becoming the first of 10 hunger strike casualties. This tragedy attracted international attention, and Margaret Thatcher's actions were sharply criticized. However, after the hunger strike ended, many of the prisoners' demands were met, although they were never officially granted political prisoner status. The 1990s became a time of gradual transition to peaceful negotiations. After Thatcher's departure, attempts to establish dialogue began. The key event was the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 under the leadership of Tony Blair and with the participation of many politicians and public figures from both sides. This agreement laid the foundation for peaceful coexistence, granting the people of Northern Ireland the right to decide for themselves whether they wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom or unite with Ireland.